Well, thank you again, Julianne, and again, a big thanks to Dick Martin, without whose help, as I mentioned last week, I couldn't do these presentations. So I'm very grateful to Dick, and I'm very grateful to Julianne for all their help. As she mentioned, two things. Um, I did a paper earlier in the year, back in April, I believe it was, and there are hard copies in the back, and Julianne is very kindly will make the paper available to you electronically should you want to receive it by email, should you have any interest. But before we start today's program, I just wanted to share a little something. I saw a note yesterday. I subscribe to The Economist, and there may be others in here who do as well. And The Economist publishes a daily newsletter electronically. And in yesterday's Sunday newsletter, the editor of the digital edition of The Economist, his name is Adam Roberts, and he works out of London. He had a little note at the end of it that I thought was timely, and I just wanted to share it with you. He was responding to messages he received from two professional colleagues, one in South Africa and one in the UK. And he said to these two individuals, "Thanks again for your messages that point to the UN's failure to play a meaningful role over Russia's war of aggression and its war crimes in Ukraine. Isn't it time to reform it?" Meaning the United Nations. "Isn't it time to reform it? And by implication, to reduce Russia's sway over it? Such an outcome might be welcome, but as long as Russia has its veto and has China as an ally, I don't see how to get there," is what he said. So that caused me to fire off an email late last night to him. And I said, "Dear Mr. Roberts, as an Economist subscriber, I read today's Sunday digital newsletter, and I saw your note of thanks that referenced these messages regarding the UN's failure to play a meaningful role over Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. In your comment, excuse me, sorry. In your comment, you note that reform in the UN to allow greater action against Russia might be welcome, but you don't see how to get there. But I believe there is a way to get there. There's a way through the UN General Assembly, and attached is a paper I wrote earlier this year that explains it. And then I attached the paper. And I asked him to at least give a look to it, and particularly look at some of the articles in the UN Charter, particularly Article 10 as it relates to Article 12, as it provides a basis for the Uniting for Peace resolution, which itself, I told him, provides a basis for the UN General Assembly to call upon member nations to provide assistance, including military assistance, to a victim of aggression. So I don't know if my email to him and sending my paper will do any good, but I hope it will, or I hope it at least gets someone's attention. Maybe he can at least make it available to the two parties that inquired and raised this issue. So on this note of optimism, we can begin today's presentation. And at the end, I hope we can have a discussion and answer any questions you might have. So Julianne, can we do the program? Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our program on Russia's invasion of Ukraine that we've been looking at in the larger context of standing up to aggression, and particularly aggression that's being committed by a major power who's not only a permanent member of the UN Security Council, but also a power that possesses nuclear weapons. And of course, that presents a very large challenge indeed. Before we get into the topic of aggression again, I'd like to say a few words about the United Nations, because we've been talking about it, and it's very important. We'll be talking about it again. And a question came up in the Q&A session in last week's program about whether or not the United Nations had outgrown its usefulness. And it's a legitimate question, especially when you consider it in the light of what we saw as the first purpose of the United Nations, and that is to keep and enforce the peace, international peace and security and world order. And we look to see how they're doing in 2022, and there are some problems for sure. So it's a legitimate question, but since we're focusing so much on the UN, I thought it might be a good idea to talk about the UN just for a minute or two, a little more broadly, and talk about the work that the United Nations does day in and day out, largely behind the scenes, out of the public view. I mentioned that I like to think of the United Nations as three general, separate organizations under this larger United Nations umbrella. We talked about the General Assembly being the town hall, where 193 nations send their representatives. They come together. Each nation gets a chance to say its piece, talk about its concern, even air its grievances. And there's another aspect to it as well, in the context that we talked about of being able to form consensus, and that is to do networking. And a lot of networking takes place in the context of the General Assembly, excuse me, in the General Assembly, where these representatives get together. They can talk about regional issues. They can form little study groups and do generally what we know as networking. That's the General Assembly. And then the Security Council we talked about, that was the organization set up to keep the peace and enforce the peace as necessary through collective military action. And we saw that they have primary jurisdiction in doing that. And then there's everything else. And that's the United Nations programs, its departments, and its agencies. And that's a vast organization. And that works day in and day out, often working with government agencies around the world and non-governmental organizations such as, Doctors Without Borders, and different programs focusing on hunger, nation building, education, providing shelter, public health, and so on. And the UN provides a basis for these NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and in some cases even the governmental agencies working together. I just want to give you an idea of the breadth and the extent of these organizations. And you see a few of them up there right now, but I'll just go through a list briefly and just give you an idea. There's the Food and Agricultural Organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, the International Labor Organization, International Maritime Organization, International Monetary Fund, which I'm sure everyone has heard of, the International Telecommunications Union, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, and I think almost everybody in this room likely heard of UNESCO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, the Universal Postal Union, we talked a bit about that last week, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization. We talked about how patents are recognized around the world. And then Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, International Atomic Energy Agency, the International Organization for Migration, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the list goes on. And here is a depiction of some of the programs and some of the developmental goals that the United Nations established in 2015, just some of the things they're working on. And they're all the things that I mentioned briefly and were covered by these specialized agencies of the UN, poverty, hunger, and health, education, and on and on and on. And you can just see from this depiction a graphic display of some of these organizations. Then, of course, there's the peacekeeping, and we talked about that. These are the forces that countries around the world contribute to keeping the peace, usually getting in between, I won't say necessarily warring functions all the time, but functions, organizations and entities that have engaged in armed conflict with each other. This is the UN's attempt to try to keep the peace in these areas and keep the forces apart. Most of them are centered in Africa and the Middle East, but not totally. And for example, there are 12 peacekeeping operations in existence right now in July of 2022. 12, like I said, largely in Africa and the Middle East, but also in between India and Pakistan in a disputed region known as Kashmir, where India and Pakistan have been skirmishing for years. They're active there. And also in Kosovo, which is a region of the former Yugoslavia that is in dispute today. And we're not hearing about a lot of actual conflict, armed conflict with destruction and human suffering in these areas where the UN peacekeeping forces are in place. And that's a good thing. So they're doing all this work behind the scenes, largely out of public view. And I just wanted to talk about that for a few minutes. So we can decide whether in total the United Nations has outlived its usefulness. But I think a good case can be made that when you look at the organization overall, it still functions. And I like to separate the questions of has the UN outlived its usefulness from has it achieved its primary purpose? And I think, at least in my mind, the answer would be has it outlived its usefulness? I would say no, it has not. But has it achieved its primary purpose since 1945? I would say, again, no, it has not. And there's still a lot of work to be done. Well, last week we talked about the difficulties of having the international community come together collectively to confront aggression militarily, despite the primary purpose of the UN being to do just that in the interest of maintaining world peace and world order. We noted that the UN Security Council was the means established explicitly and primarily for this purpose, but because of the permanent member veto, it could be prevented from acting when unanimity among the permanent members could not be achieved. And we concluded in last week's session by noting that the UN Charter contains a safety valve. That's language I like to call a safety valve that would allow the UN General Assembly to confront aggression when such action is blocked in the Security Council. We also noted that a strong argument exists in customary international law, even outside the UN Charter, that would allow the nations of the world to come together and then engage in what the UN Charter calls, and what actually is under customary international law, an inherent right of individual or collective self-defense. But with these in mind, let's first look at the UN Charter for a minute. And again, I brought my book, the United Nations Charter. And again, I have a text for this little sermon that I'm giving today. And it comes principally from Articles 10 and 12 of the United Nations Charter, a little bit in in Article 11, but mostly in Article 10 and Article 12. And I'd like to just kind of read that to you so you can see how some of these things, how all this kind of fits together. I think it's helpful to do that. Article 10 is entitled Functions and Powers. And it reads as follows. General Assembly. The General Assembly may discuss any questions or any matters within the scope of the present charter or relating to the powers and functions of any organs provided for in the present charter, and except as provided in Article 12, may make recommendations to the members of the United Nations or to the Security Council or both on any such questions or matters. So Article 10, which you may recall from last week's session, was the language that these other 47 countries at San Francisco in 1945 kind of insisted upon and exacted in order to gain their acceptance of the permanent member veto in the Security Council. And Article 12 says, while the Security Council is exercising in respect to any dispute or situation the functions assigned to it, the General Assembly shall not make any recommendation with regard to the dispute or situation unless the Security Council so requests. So that's how these two fit together, which gives the General Assembly jurisdiction, very broad jurisdiction to discuss any matter and to make recommendations to the members of the United Nations, even regarding military action, except when the Security Council is exercising its functions under Article 12. And we saw that in the case of Ukraine, and we'll talk about that a little more. The Security Council is not exercising its functions with regard to Russia's invasion of Ukraine because action was blocked by Russia's exercise of the permanent member veto. Now, the safety valve argument first came up in 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States was very heavily invested in South Korea, and they wanted collective action to stop the aggression and push the North Koreans back across their border. The fear then was that the Soviet Union, which was a strong ally of North Korea, would block the action in the Security Council. But in the end, this was averted because the Soviet Union was boycotting sessions of the Security Council over the issue of which Chinese government, nationalist or communist, was the proper representative of China in the Security Council. And the sentiment of the members of the UN overall was generally in favor of having the nationalist government, that was the government under Chiang Kai-shek at the time, being the proper representative of China in the UN. This made the Soviet Union very unhappy. They were backing the communist government under Mao Zedong, and they essentially took their ball and went home. But that provided an opening, and so the United States and others who were pushing for enforcement action against North Korea were able to get a favorable vote in the Security Council. But from almost the beginning, the Soviets were obstructionists in the Security Council, and the U.S. felt that something had to be done institutionally. They said, it was just under fortuitous circumstances that we were able to get this vote on Korea because the Soviet representatives were absent. But we can't count on that. So we need something that's institutionally, that we can set institutionally to deal with a situation when action's blocked in the Security Council. So in a speech before the UN General Assembly, the U.S. representative at the time was John Foster Dulles, who later became Secretary of State. He argued that the broad reach of Article 10 was exacted by the smaller powers at San Francisco as the price for their acceptance of the permanent member veto. And this is what they had in mind. They were insistent that there be a way for the General Assembly to act when the Security Council was blocked from acting because of the permanent member veto. Now, at the time, the U.S. was the biggest proponent of enabling the UN to take collective military action to confront aggression. Both President Truman and Secretary of State Dean Acheson recognized again that it was only through these fortuitous circumstances that the Security Council was able to act in the case of Korea, and that something more permanent, more standing needed to be done. And this led in 1950 to the adoption in the General Assembly of the Uniting for Peace resolution. We talked about this in the Q&A session a little bit last week, but this is a very, very important development, the adoption of the Uniting for Peace, and that the Uniting for Peace is still very much in play today with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so the United States put forth a number of draft resolutions and proposals, and they were modified through discussion. Actually, the United States representative said, we need to have what the U.S. representative called a peace patrol. We need to have UN forces in place that could rush in and quell any major disturbance and put out these brush fires that they were concerned with that might erupt around the world, and did. And so this led, after negotiation and compromise and more negotiation and more compromise, in the adoption of the Uniting for Peace resolution, which was sponsored by the UN and was passed over the strenuous objection of the UN, but it was passed with a large margin, 52-5, with 2 abstentions. Now, I want to read what the resolution says. The heart of the resolution is this language. If the Security Council, because of lack of unanimity of the permanent members, fails to exercise its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, in any case where there appears to be a threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or act of aggression, the General Assembly shall consider the matter immediately with a view to making appropriate recommendations to all the members of the UN for collective measures, including, in the case of a breach of the peace or act of aggression, the use of armed force when necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. And the vehicle for doing this under the Uniting for Peace resolution was a provision for convening what the resolution calls emergency special sessions to deal with security matters. And this was done. This was done from 1950 until February and March of this year, again, concerning Ukraine. The first one was in response to the crisis in the Suez Canal in 1956. And then that was the first one. And then there were 9 more leading up to 10. And then the 11th emergency special session was called this year. And it's still an open session to deal with the aggression against Ukraine. But in none of these sessions has the General Assembly gone so far as to urge member states to provide armed forces for enforcement action. That is military action against an aggressor, although the resolution empowers them to do so. And that was the case again this year regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The resolution that was passed in the General Assembly did not go so far as to call upon the member states to provide military forces to confront Russia. Now, interestingly, when the Uniting for Peace resolution was being debated, this whole idea of, well, it's a great thing, but do we actually really need it? Because under international law, there's this inherent right of individual or collective self-defense. So the countries of the world could come together and take military action against Russia, even without relying on the language of the UN Charter. So that was the argument, and it does have a very firm basis in international law. And this was raised by the representative from the UK back in 1950 when Uniting for Peace was being debated. And he says, His Majesty's government believes there exists ample basis in established customary international law for nations to take individual or collective measures in self-defense irrespective of the UN Charter, and that the Charter explicitly recognizes this right as inherent, which it does in Article 51. And Article 51, which is very, very short, basically says this very thing. In fact, it says this very thing. It calls it that nothing in the Charter shall impede the inherent right of nations to take individual or collective self-defense. Now, despite this, I want to kind of drill down a little bit on this a bit, because despite this, and why perhaps the General Assembly up to this point has never really called upon member nations to provide military enforcement, is because there has been great debate. Debate, as I say here, has raged in the United Nations itself, in the General Assembly, in debate in the Security Council, in the chambers of national legislatures, in the studios and newsrooms of the media, and in the halls of the Academy over the relative competencies of the Security Council and the General Assembly in this area of maintaining international peace and security. And this has put a damper on the willingness of the General Assembly to take strong enforcement action. But while these arguments are often clothed in the robes of international jurisprudence, that is international law, they are at their core political, and are based on a determination to retain power. For example, had the General Assembly's resolution, which was passed on March 2nd of this year, which is entitled Aggression Against Ukraine, which of course was adopted again after Russia blocked action in the Security Council, had it gone so far as to call upon the member states to take collective military action to confront Russia, pushback from the U.S. and its allies would have been certain, based on fear of the bully. And we'll talk about that a little more, particularly toward the end here. This is a drastic change in policy on the part of the U.S. since its intervention in Korea, Vietnam, and after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. And this change in policy, at least in part, this fear of the bully, is enabling Russia's continuing aggression against Ukraine. Now, the importance of laying out this history is to show that today in 22, there is a sound basis in international law for the community of nations to organize itself to deter aggression, and when necessary, to confront it militarily. And this was the promise of the UN back in 1945, and it still has yet to be achieved. Had this been done prior to the present time, it is doubtful that the world would be witnessing the destruction of a modern, developed, and peaceful country and the wholesale terrorizing of its civilian population by a major power that is engaging in aggression and is engaging in the intentional targeting of innocent civilians, which itself is a war crime under the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and a later protocol of 1977. So, again, going back to 2008, Russia invades the Republic of Georgia, and we saw on a map where it went in and it seized territory, and then after negotiations, and it got some of the concessions it wanted, it withdrew, for the most part, from these territories in the Republic of Georgia, but not totally. There are still Russian forces in these areas of the Republic of Georgia that Russia seized in 2008, and the international community did nothing. And of course, we see in Crimea in 2014, Russia invaded, seized the entirety of Crimea, and then annexed it to Russia, and the international community did nothing. So what can be done? At present, there are 193 member nations of the UN that can come together. They can put together a regime. They can say enough is enough, put together a regime for confronting aggression, and they can do it, I believe, preferably within the confines of the UN Charter, but they even have the competence to do it outside of the UN Charter should they choose to do so. So there's a viable route forward, a way out of endless chaos and suffering, and it is for the UN General Assembly to pick up the ball when actions blocked in the Security Council and call upon the member states to take collective military action to confront the aggressor. And this is essentially doing what the Security Council is supposed to do and was set up to do and may not do because its action is blocked by the permanent member veto. But realistically, building up the political will for the General Assembly to act in this matter will take a lot of groundwork, including gaining the support of most, if not all, of the major powers, without whose participation collective military action to confront an aggressor is likely to be ineffective. In reality, it just wouldn't happen. Without getting the major powers on board, at least most of them, division in the Security Council shows that in any particular situation where there's an act of aggression, there's probably some major power behind it, either engaging in the aggression directly or providing support or at least being in sympathy with the aggressor. So as a practical matter, as a realistic matter, can you count on all the major powers? No. And I think the division in the Security Council is ample evidence of that. So, but you need most of them because the participation of the major powers is necessary when you have collective military action put together under the UN auspices in the General Assembly, for example, in order for the military action to be effective. So clearly, as the situation in Ukraine shows, major power politics, both domestic and geopolitical, have been obstacles in establishing peace and world order. And this has been true since 1945, but this has to stop. The international community has to come together and say, enough. The proxy wars that the major powers initiate or support have to stop. And this is basically every conflict that has taken place since 1945. It has been, in some sense, a proxy war between the major powers. Korea was a proxy war. Vietnam was a proxy war. The conflict in the Middle East largely has been a proxy war, each one, where one side backed one side to the one major power backed one party to the conflict, and another major power backed the other side. And we saw this in Southeast Asia. We see this in Africa. We see it in the Middle East. We see it in Latin America. And it's been going on and on and on. But it has to stop. Now, in 2022, the community of nations is in a position to make it stop. And the need to do so couldn't be more urgent because of basically technology and the improvement in weapons and their means of delivery. So it's a very urgent matter, and it's getting worse day by day. And regarding Ukraine, back in the General Assembly again, all that has happened is talk, talk, talk. This is the way the major powers like it, because they preserve their powers that way. But this too has to stop. The General Assembly resolution of March 2nd, entitled Aggression Against Ukraine, is a classic garden variety UN resolution. It contains all the usual recollections, condemnations, expressions, and demand. We demand that these hostilities stop and the parties engage in negotiations to restore peace and good order. But without effective enforcement actions, history has shown repeatedly since 1945 that all this language is meaningless. Nothing in this resolution has stopped the next civilian casualty of Russia's aggression. And here we are, 5 months on, and the destruction and human suffering continues to this day. While the Uniting for Peace resolution could form an adequate basis for a new regime to call upon the member states for collective military action, and I hope it will, and it has the promise to, it has the potential to, it's clear that so far these emergency special sessions so far have not been effective in doing so. Something bigger and grander in design is needed, again, because there doesn't exist the international consensus that's necessary as the groundwork to have real meaningful action in the General Assembly. That has to be established. That has to be put together. Something has to happen. Some catalyst has to happen to bring the 193 members of the United Nations together and say, okay, enough, let's get something done. And if there's any hope for this, somebody has to initiate it. And the UN Secretary General, who, by the way, is very active on this very day. I saw a report this morning where he and the UN is facilitating talks between Russia and Ukraine to get the grain shipments flowing again. So here's another example of the UN in action this very day. And it's under the auspices of Antonio Guterres, the present United Nations Secretary General, that this is happening. So he's in a position to initiate action in the General Assembly and get something going on this. He has a worldwide constituency, and he has the ability, just like he did this morning, to capture media attention around the world, especially if he were to come out with some unprecedented and bold proposition for achieving world peace. The UN Secretary General has the power and should use it to convene a special conference of all UN members and experts in the field of international law, international relations, in and out of government, to come together in a conference, a global conference, and make recommendations to institutionalize an effective, immediate response by the General Assembly when action in the Security Council is blocked. So this is just one proposal. I mean, there are many. The main purpose of my presentation, and I think it'll become more crystallized as we wrap it up here, was basically to get people thinking about this. How do we do it? I think we've established the need for it. It's urgent, it's important, it's critical to provide the stability that the world needs to thrive, for nations to thrive, for international commerce and international relations to thrive. So the need is clear, but how do we address it? And this is just one proposal that in my research and looking at the problem broadly that I came up with. But I'm just one person and not the brightest guy on the planet, for sure. And I'm hoping that we might be able to spur some interest on the part of others to take a look at this, consider the problem, and come up with ideas better than my own. But the one that I came up with was this idea of a UN conference. It could be done under Uniting for Peace. They could take this open 11th emergency special session and they could expand it into this conference that I'm proposing. So in addition to formulating rules and procedures for what could be done formally in the General Assembly, the biggest purpose and the biggest benefit, I think, of having this global conference would be to work again on this idea of forming a worldwide consensus that something needs to be done. And then we'll focus on how to get it done. And this would hopefully include a commitment of each nation to contribute to the arrangement, no matter what it turns out to be. But it's got to be, again, going back to what I talked about last week, establishing this credible military force so that a potential aggressor is given pause. Wait a minute, if I invade my neighbor, there's going to be a response. There's going to be a response against it. It's going to be a meaningful one. So maybe that potential aggressor will think long and hard and say, well, maybe there's another way, a more peaceful way to try to pursue my national interest. So that's the hope, that's the goal. And to have this credible force, ideally, it would include a commitment of each nation to contribute to the arrangement to the best of its ability, consistent with the level of its national resources. I go back to that earlier slide when you saw the UN peacekeepers. They're not forces from major countries. They're forces from small countries, countries with small economies. But they're providing these forces. They're saying this is something we can do. And every nation has something it can do. And the hope would be that it would contribute to this UN force consistent with the level of its national resources. And again, participation by the major powers is absolutely essential. The precursor to the United Nations was the League of Nations, which the United States did not join. And one of the major failures of the League of Nations was the fact that the United States did not join. And the fact that the United Nations didn't join meant that other world powers did not give their all to the organization. They held back. And the history of the League of Nations shows this. It was a failed organization because the heart of the major powers wasn't in it. The United States said, no, we're not joining. But Britain and the other major powers at the time kind of joined half-heartedly and half-heartedly committed to the organization. And history shows that that contributed largely to its failure. So we need the major powers, and they do have legitimate concerns. And every effort should be made to accommodate their legitimate interests. We have to work hard to get the major powers on board, because if they don't come on board, it's not going to work. So we should try to accommodate their interests, and they should be assured that they won't be in it alone. They'll have the support of all the members of the UN, financially, materially, and morally. So, it's not going to be a leader out in front who turns around and says, hey, where are my troops? Who's behind me? They have to know that the world community is behind their efforts. And this is important because it goes back to the founding of the United Nations. It has to be a broad consensus. In order to achieve a broad consensus in the United Nations, we have to put aside differences over an individual nation's political system, over its individual economic system. So without judging any nation's political point of view, the threat of further aggression and breaches of the peace looms large in what is increasingly an unstable security environment. Aggression is aggression, no matter who commits it, and it must be the underlying understanding and bedrock principle that forms the basis for this proposed widely participated UN conference, 193 countries. So you're never going to get agreement among all the nations of the world. I mean, we see this every day in terms of a political system or an economic system. And that was the bedrock principle of establishing the United Nations. The major powers at the end of the war knew they could not get everybody together to agree on an economic system or a political system, just among themselves. The Soviet Union had an economic system and a political system far different than the United States or Great Britain, yet they came together to put together themselves this organization that we call the United Nations. And the idea was there was one criterion for membership in this organization, and that is working toward world peace. You had to be peace-loving, as they put it. If you were peace-loving and you were interested in working for world peace, or at least if you're willing to say so, then you could be a member of the United Nations. And it was felt that a lot of these differences would be ironed out as nations came together in this forum, in the General Assembly, got to know each other, and that would be a moderating force with regard to all the differences in politics and economic matters that prevailed around the world and still prevail around the world. So again, realistically, a conference of this type and magnitude is not likely to happen without a lot of preliminary groundwork to lay the necessary foundation. So we have foundation building necessary on two levels. We have foundation building needing to take place within the General Assembly once you got the nations there in the first place. But in order to get the nations there in the first place, some further groundwork needs to be done. Some more preliminary groundwork has to be done. And I would like to suggest that the best place to do this is the academy. A good start would be for a major university or universities to obtain funding to bring experts both in and out of government together who are committed to finding a way to achieve and maintain peace through collective military action, both as a deterrent and where necessary military force to restore peace and good order. And the conference within the academy, I would like to suggest, would be a good place to start, and their published proceedings and their reports, widely disseminated, could provide a starting point for work in the UN. So I'm proposing that this initial work start to take place in the academy, and we know from academic conferences and all, they produce papers, reports, and these could be extensive if the conference or conferences around the world are themselves extensive and could produce all these reports that could provide a starting point in the UN. And as current events demonstrate, there's no greater urgency than exists right now. Because now nuclear blackmail by a major power and permanent member of the Security Council has been added to the challenge of maintaining and restoring peace. So if the community of nations is afraid to confront an aggressor that has nuclear weapons, then really, I mean, there's almost no hope. For how can there ever be peace and world order, which we know are necessary for human societies to thrive? And again, you know, we're seeing the effects of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. We talked about a 3% decline in global GDP this year, supply chain disruptions around the world, and the difficulty in keeping this coalition against Ukraine together when the bite of sanctions and the bite of all these economic consequences of Russia's invasions come into play, such as winter's coming. It's going to be a cold winter in Europe. We need oil and gas, and so far Russia is essential in providing this. So all this provides pressure on the coalition to not be together totally on many issues. So that's a challenge, keeping it together. Russia's action against Ukraine has been massive. It's not just all the death and destruction. Economically, its blockade of Ukraine's ports are essentially leaving Ukraine a landlocked country that can't export its grain. So hopefully these measures that are taking place under the UN today will provide some relief to that, but we'll have to see. And the longer this goes on, the more it supports Russia in its position for eventual negotiations to end the conflict. The more bargaining chips that Russia has and will have gives it greater leverage in the negotiations that will be necessary to end this conflict. And it's all because, again, going back, this all could have been avoided. No one stopped Putin in 2008. No one stopped him in 2014. And here we are in 2022. So I just want to say, as I wrapped up, I wrote a paper on this subject, and there are copies in the back, and for anyone who might want a paper copy. Plus, I want to talk to Julianne and see if we can make it available electronically. So anybody who wants it could contact her or myself, and we'll give it to you electronically. But when I wrote this paper, which essentially incorporates all the points of this presentation, it goes deeper into international law, probably talks more about international law that most of you would want to even be bothered with. But I wrote this paper. It's kind of academic in nature. And I made many, many calls. I called organizations. I called universities. I talked to political science professors at UF. I called my alma mater. I called think tanks. I called foreign affairs. And I got the same reaction when I called. And that'll enable me just to zip through these remaining slides here. I got the same action when I recalled, and actually, in a few instances, I was able to engage people in some meaningful discussion, and I'm really grateful for that. But it all came down to fear the bully. It all came down to, yeah, your concept is very, very interesting. Now, on this idea of in the academy convening these major conferences, that takes institutional support. And institutional support takes money, and in the realm of the academy, there's this constant battle among departments and programs for funding, and we can never get enough. And right now, I heard this from UF. Right now, the emphasis is on technology, artificial intelligence, and on immediate concerns that have high priority in the funding realm. And I heard this from several sources when I called around the universities. Yeah, this is really an interesting concept, but I'm not sure it's realistic. I mean, first of all, we've never been able to get the world together to agree on much of anything. How are we going to get that? I said, well, what about the urgency? What about what this invasion of Russia shows that has not been shown us before? There's never been a conflict of this magnitude and of this nature. Two advanced countries in Europe engaged in armed conflict. This has not happened since World War II. And what about all the history going back to the Middle Ages, where every major conflict in the world started between powers in Europe, countries in Europe fighting with each other, and then expanded? What about the potential for this to expand beyond Europe, to engulf Europe, and then possibly expand beyond it? What about that? Yeah, well, yeah, it's a serious problem, but, good luck with trying to get people together. And then there was always the idea of, we can't start World War III. We can't give more aid to Russia because it'll start World War III. And I just want to, I can rush through the remaining slides. There was one source that I called, and I was able to engage a man in discussion. And it was one of the publications. I sent this paper far and wide, and then made my follow-up calls. And he said, well, again, interesting, but unrealistic. And now we can't give any more aid to Ukraine than we're given. We can't give them enough to actually win this war because of Russia, and Russia having nuclear weapons. And I said, well, first of all, with that fear of the bully, we could never achieve world peace. And I said, secondly, what if Ukraine were a member of NATO? Would the answer be different? Silence. Total silence. So we'll go to my last slide here. That ended our conversation, but the story of Zelensky and the bully lives on. The end is yet to be written. That's pretty interesting. Delivered alcohol in tumbler. Good luck with drinking that. Two things that I ran into: the objections or the concerns that caused at least me to be frustrated about trying to get past the problem of confronting a nuclear armed bully in our current age. One was, well, just the way the UN is structured, and I read you the comment from the editor at The Economist who said, such an outcome, that is reform the UN so you get past the permanent member veto, such an outcome might be welcome, but as long as Russia has the veto, I don't see how we get there. So to his thinking and the thinking of so many of the international relations and international affairs experts is that the structure of the UN itself is a permanent block to having any meaningful action in the General Assembly and possibly getting past the permanent member veto. But I hope at least I raised an argument in these two sessions, particularly the second one, where you look at the history of the UN, you look at the language of the UN Charter and how that language got there. I think it's a pretty compelling case to say that no, the General Assembly has primary jurisdiction in the area of security matters, but it does not have absolute jurisdiction. And that's clear when you read Articles 10 and 12 together. The General Assembly may discuss any matter under the sun that's included in the UN Charter and may make any recommendations to the members of the UN, today being 193 of them, including measures for military enforcement, except when the Security Council is acting. But the Security Council is not acting because in the case of Ukraine, action in the Security Council was blocked by the exercise of the veto by the aggressor itself. Now, if that's not an absurd result, I don't know what is. And then, so there's that argument to get around. And the second one is we can't start World War III. We can't stand up to the bully because the bully has nuclear weapons. Well, guess what? There are other countries that have nuclear weapons. India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. So what if India or Pakistan were to commit an act of aggression and then stand up and wave a nuclear weapon and say, you can't touch me? How do we deal with that? So I raised this question when I talked to various people. including political science professors at UF who were conceptually quite supportive, actually. And most of them I knew from coming over here and giving presentations themselves. But they raised the funding issue, saying, hey, we're just scraping by. We're not political science is not a high priority in the funding order these days. And I encountered that in other places I called. But again, there didn't seem to be a willingness anywhere on the part of anyone to explore this larger issue of dealing with an aggressor or a potential aggressor that has nuclear weapons. I raised the issue about Pakistan, for example, or India, and there are other nuclear armed countries as well. But I just use that as an example because India and Pakistan are feuding over Kashmir. They have been for years. There have been skirmishes, and sometimes these skirmishes have gotten pretty heated. And there have been casualties that come out of these hostile encounters over Kashmir. So suppose one of them, raises a nuclear weapon. Is the international community going to be afraid to confront aggression from one of them? And now, of course, we're faced with an immediate question concerning Russia. Is Putin always able to say, wait a minute, you can't touch me, I got a nuclear weapon? Are we that afraid? And first of all,